Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our hosts an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
All right. Well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Frank Perri. Frank, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to give a little bit of background on Frank. We were talking a little bit before this, before we went live here, and I think what I just recognized is that Frank might have one of the most unique backgrounds in North America, having both a legal background, in the role of a Crown attorney, and also being a CPA and having an understanding of white collar crime. And as we're going to talk about red collar crime. But to give you a little bit of background on Frank, he spent over 30 years as a criminal trial attorney. His cases range from murder to white collar crime. Frank coined the term red collar crime, and he is also a certified public accountant and a certified fraud examiner. So if we get that right, Frank is a very experienced lawyer and a very experienced CPA and certified fraud examiner. You will not find too many people with Frank's background walking around in North America for sure. He is a renowned national speaker on red and white collar crime, predatory fraud offenders, and related matters. And if you're interested in some reading, he is the author of the terrific book, Red Collar, White Collar Crime, Corporate, Predatory, and Violent Fraud Offenders. And again, if you are in the accounting or legal world especially, I would highly recommend you take a read of the book, because it goes through, not only does it cover a lot of, again, characteristics of white collar and red collar offenders, but there is a ton of great examples and case studies that he uses in the book in order to illustrate those points, which makes a book is much more interesting to read when it's supported by a bunch of examples, and there is no shortage of examples in Frank's book. If you want the shorter version, you can check out Frank's YouTube channel, and he's got a bunch of very good red collar crime videos where he goes through, gives a little bit of perspective on something associated with red collar crime, and then does a little Q&A at the end. And they're not that long. Probably average between 15 and 20 minutes. And there's probably, 7 or 8 of them up there. I would highly recommend you take a watch of those, because you're going to watch those and you're going to be surprised on what you learn. So before I read your book, Frank, I think I fell into the typical myth of a white collar criminal. And what I would have thought a white collar criminal was, or the characteristics that they would have, would probably include the following prior to me reading your book. Is, white collar criminal probably focused on the numbers, the accounting numbers, not necessarily focused on harming anybody. Maybe they're bullies in the office, they're screamers in the office, but that would never escalate to physical violence. Is that it would just be, maybe verbal abuse, but it wouldn't escalate to physical violence. In the event that a white collar criminal was caught in their offenses, I probably would have thought that they were rational, and they'd say, you know what, the authorities, they got me here, or somebody else has outed me and figured out my crime. And therefore their decision would be at that point to just give up, or to, contact an attorney and then go through the process. Needless to say, would not expect them to revert to physical violence. And as I've mentioned in each one of these points, the common trait that I'm trying to illustrate is that these white collar offenders, and perhaps even more broadly, white collar workers, would be classified as nonviolent people. However, after reading your book, Frank, and watching your YouTube videos, my perspective now has completely changed. And you're going to do a much better job of explaining this than me. So maybe I will pass it over to you to give me some perspective on why my understanding was so wrong, and give us some perspective on what the truth is surrounding white collar criminals more broadly.
Sure. That's a great question, and I'll try to unpack it for you. I think in part that we have a lot of what I would consider like mythologies surrounding white collar crime. It's almost as if we compartmentalize it. We have other crimes, and I'm just going to give a few out there just to simplify it. We have, for example, sexual assault, terrorism, arson, stalking, batteries, murders. But then somehow we put white collar crime in its own little compartment and we try to give it a different explanation to it. I think in part it has to do with several factors. Number one, over the years, we just have not devoted the type of academic resources to understand the profile. And as a result, what ends up happening is we end up relying on our own private abstractions. We just have an opinion to have an opinion because we have an opinion about things. So it's not that, we're trying to be cute about it. It's just that it's not necessarily based on real observation and quality research. So we've devoted a lot of time, what I would say is to the non-white collar crime offender. And it's also, I think, a little bit more popularized on TV. All right. So we see that a lot. So we've lost many, many decades in creating a proper profile or profiles about them. No differently than, say, for example, we have homicide. We have different types of homicides. We've spent a lot of resources in understanding all the different types of homicide that may exist, but we haven't done the same thing to the white collar crime. Point number two, I think it's also in the definition itself. So when you think of the definition of white collar crime, typically they say it's a non-violent offense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In and of itself, I get that. But what's happened is that I think that we've extrapolated the definition to also apply to the offender. That if it's a non-violent offense, that means that the offender themselves is non-violent because it's a non-violent offense. That's not accurate also. In addition, you see these methodologies also carried through in academia and also the judiciary, where a lot of people in academia just would say, well, these are not people who commit violent acts. They don't know why they're not, they don't have a basis for that opinion, but they'll just make that. And I've seen that over and over again in the literature, and not only in the literature in terms of academics, but also in textbooks, where they talk about the offender as if it's an accident.
Yep.
When it's not. You see that also in the judiciary, sometimes in law enforcement. They think, well, you know what, this is not something that we're going to see. Why is that? Because often when we think of crime, we think of street level offenses. So if we see something within the white collar community, it's seen as a one-off. Somehow it's not planned, when that's actually woefully inaccurate. I mean, Bernie Madoff spent, as we know, years committing his crimes. So I'll take a pause there for you and be, wherever you want me to go with that. But I think that kind of encapsulates some of the things. But this is what I would share with you. When you don't have a proper profile, what happens is that you may end up having a flawed risk assessment. You may not make a quality decision because the decisions that you're making it on are not based on fact, but on just opinions, abstractions. And can lead us down a false sense of security with people, especially fraud examiners. So,
and so the common myth is that, white collar criminals are, like you say, one-offs, non-violent. Even the term white collar, you think of the term, it doesn't portray as some sort of a violent criminal act. At what point, did you realize that just because someone is a white collar criminal, that all of a sudden it can turn violent? Like where, this myth again, that there is no connection between white collar crime and violence. Clearly that's wrong. At what point did you realize that wasn't a proper conclusion at the end of the day?
Sure. I would have to say it was about 20 years ago. I've worked both in prosecution for many years and also criminal defense. So I could probably give you a well-rounded understanding of how the system works. But I was involved in a homicide case where there was also a fraud element to it. And there was a white collar crime complexion to it, where one business partner basically ended up killing another business partner. And the person was held accountable for it. But after that, and I guess is where, as a CPA, that's where the fraud element all of a sudden started to kick in for me. But yet there was also the question where I had to challenge my own understanding of crime, even though I had been involved in it, because it was so atypical. And it's so atypical because typically you can see the risk factors when they come together that you can understand how something can happen. For example, when we hear of the tragedies of somebody who was engaged in drug trafficking and somebody gets killed, it's tragedy, but it is foreseeable. We can see how that plays itself out. And after the trial was over and the case had resolved, I couldn't shake. There was just something inside of me that I just could not reconcile for myself. And as a result, I ended up doing a lot of deep dive into try to find out, is there an aspect of white collar crime that can be violent? Is there where an offender could cross the line?
Yep.
And the more digging that I did, the more I saw that there was there was no research on it. As many different ways that I would put in the search engine to try to find, I think somebody must have wrote this. I found that the research on it, meaning academic research for the most part, was either inaccurate, incomplete, or non-existent altogether. So I could not find anything that had to do with violent white-collar criminals. All that kept coming up was white-collar criminals are non-violent. And yet, that was not my experience. So then I said to myself, okay, are there other cases that are analogous at least to what I experienced? And over the decades, because literally it's something, this was not just a 1 month project. This is something over the years, you have to start doing the deep dive to find other white collar offenders who would end up crossing the line and killing. And that's where, in a sense, the concept of red collar crime came up, where white collar offenders turned violent. So they went from being not just a white collar offender, but now they're red collar offenders. And the motive is basically, from what I could gather from all these different cases, is that they're trying to silence the person that is either detected and or disclosed their fraud. And that seems to be that trigger point. That seems to be the stressor that seems to push them over the edge.
I see. So if we start with the white collar criminal before we go into the red collar criminal, what would you say are then some of the common characteristics of a white collar criminal? They talk about the fraud triangle. You need three different. You need an incentive and a pressure and et cetera, et cetera. But is there a certain set of characteristics based on your experience that someone would be more susceptible to committing a white collar crime as to maybe somebody else who wouldn't do that? Is there some characteristic that kind of you fall into that white collar criminal definition?
Sure. What I would say is that this is where, as I said earlier, we tend to kind of compartmentalize the white collar crime. And what I'm sharing with you is that whether it's white collar or non-white collar really is irrelevant. The question that you have to ask yourself is, what are their criminal thinking traits that facilitate them to go down a certain path?
Yeah.
So whether or not, you may have somebody who's white collar, well educated, but they may be relying on the same criminal thinking traits as, say, for example, a drug trafficker or an arsonist. All right.
Yeah.
Now, what the literature does in academics is this: they always talk about what I would call descriptive. The person is a middle-aged white person, male, or they give these type of descriptors, but that doesn't tell me anything. I kept reading this. Okay, tell me how these people think about what they're going to exploit. So, for example, we, as CPAs, we understand internal controls. All right. How is a white collar offender going to exploit the internal controls? All right. But exploitation comes in different forms. That concept, Scott, of aggression comes in different forms. You can manifest your aggression in different manners to satisfy a certain motive. So somebody may say, you know what? I'm going to go into a bank. I want money, and I'm going to take it violently. Okay. Or you may have somebody in the back room there who's going to say, I'm going to exploit the internal controls to get money. They're aggressing in a different form, but they're still wanting the same thing.
Yeah.
So what I would say to your audience is that how are people thinking about exploitable opportunities? For example, let me give you an example in terms of the white collar aspect, just just to support your what you're trying to get at. There's a concept in criminology and criminal thinking called goal interference. Now, goal interference means, and I'll give you an example for the audience. You come home, somebody's in your house trying to burglarize it because they want what you had. Okay. You try to stop them.
Yeah.
You're getting in the way of what they want, their goal. And guess what? If they have to take you out, they'll take you out. I'm not trying to, make this dramatic, but that's the reality because I've dealt with that.
Yep.
Now, here, for example, you are, say, for an accountant or a CFO or somebody that says, you know what, we have a problem here. Well, you know what, Scott, you want to report these type of findings. I guess you're not going to be getting that raise, that promotion you want. You know why? Because you're kind of getting in the way of what I want. So what I'm trying to get at is how can we take these wonderful concepts and then apply them in different circumstances? But that's why I share with you criminal thinking, or more broadly, and I want to make it clear for your audience, antisocial thinking. Because a lot of people think that if they're not doing something criminal, that means it's okay. No, you can still be doing something that's antisocial and unethical. All right. But they're still relying on those same thinking traits in order to satisfy an agenda. All right.
So if you take a white collar criminal and would compare them to a home invader as the bank robber, is there a lot of similarities between those? Like, at the end of the day, what you're saying is that there are some common traits of criminals, irrespective of the type of crime, whether it be a white collar crime or whether it be perhaps some other crime, is that a criminal is a criminal and that they would share some of those same characteristics. Is that fair?
Spot on. It's basically crime. I'll make it simple. Crime classification neutral.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. All right. It's crime classification neutral. You know what the problem, if I could just go off on a slight tangent, is that I think people get what I call the seduction of appearances. And the seduction of appearances is that we think that because somebody doesn't look like a street level offender, maybe shiftless, and that they went to Harvard and they're clean cut and they speak eloquently, that somehow that person has a higher moral authority than the person who is a street level offenders. But I would remind the audience that some of the worst atrocities in our history were committed by the most educated within their societies. They need not have necessarily always done the act itself, but they sure didn't have a problem ordering it. And at times they participated. So that's why I'm sharing with you is don't look at the offender. Think about how they think about what they want. And you will see it's crime classification neutral.
Now, you use some good, that concept of goal interference is interesting. Maybe you can talk about maybe a couple other characteristics. I think what is very important in what you're saying, and again, one of the big realizations that people should recognize is that white collar criminals can become violent offenders. Again, what you're talking about is criminality neutral. Is that it doesn't matter. A crime is a crime. So those criminals are going to share several of the same characteristics, whether it's a white collar criminal or not. That's basically what we're saying. And maybe just talk a little bit about what are some of those characteristics. So you mentioned goal interference is a really good example. Maybe just talk a little bit about entitlement. Is that, is that something that, again, talking criminality neutral, that would be shared amongst all of these folks? Is that a sense of entitlement?
Sure. Entitlement, and what entitlement, I'll answer the question to entitlement, and then I'll just piggyback back to the goal interference to tie it in for you. With entitlement, that means that you somehow have this sense of access to resources, privileges, regardless of the imposition that it could put somebody in. It's like, I'm entitled to the pay raise, but I'm not getting the pay raise. Therefore, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to go and exploit your internal control weaknesses to get what I want. All right. Analogously, something, say, for example, with sexual assault. You know what? I'm entitled to exploiting somebody in that manner because you know what? I am who I am, and I'm going to take what I want, regardless of the harm it's going to do someone else. So you combine that, say, with goal interference. You have a white collar criminal who says, you know what? You're kind of getting in the way of my fraud scheme.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You know what, Scott? You should have minded your own business. And guess what? Even if you don't know about the fraud scheme, if they think that you know about it, it doesn't matter. And then when we talk about the personality traits, and I'll explain why that's even a bigger problem for you. You know what, Scott? You're in the way, buddy.
Now, what about weakness exploitation? How does
Sure.
that come into another common trait of a criminal that, again,
Sure.
ranges a whole bunch of different offenses?
Well, I'll give you an example of weakness exploitation. A lot of times what somebody who is criminally minded will do is they'll ask themselves, who can I take out with the least amount of an effort? It would be analogous to what you see at times on these wildlife shows where you'll have a bunch of lions who have to go and take out the weakest in the herd because it's the least amount of effort, but for the greatest gain.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, think about it from a criminal's perspective. You have a criminal who's going to say, well, do I take do I go and steal Scott's wallet, Frank's wallet, or do I go and take out the 90-year-old woman's purse? Or do I go and exploit the 3-year-old? Okay, because I know that they'll never be able to speak of what I did to them. Who do I get? Who's the weakest? Does that?
Oh yeah, no, that certainly makes sense. Now, the other thing I want to ask you too is that the folks who commit these crimes, whether again it be a bank robbery or a home invasion or whatever it may be, do they not see the risk associated with what they're doing that they might get caught? Does that not come into the equation? Like some of these cases that you talk about in your book, where they're about to get caught, and all of a sudden they're going to go out and take out 5 or 6 different people. You sent me an article the other day about they're going to take out the judge and the FBI agents, and like it just seems completely do they not appreciate that they might actually get caught when they do this?
Sure, absolutely. They engage in a risk assessment, but something you should consider is this. They may display and harbor what is referred to in the literature as immunity or super optimism. What does that mean? I'm so good, I'm not going to get caught.
Yeah.
And something to consider too is that they do get away with it. People get away with fraud all the time and there are no consequences. People get away with selling narcotics and then they will never get caught. So they do engage in a risk assessment, absolutely. It may be a shock to them once they get caught. Then that's a little bit difficult for their own ego to internalize, yes. But they engage in a risk assessment. The question is, that's where issues of personality may come in.
Yeah.
That the way you and I might engage in risk assessment can be totally different than the way they do. Let me give you an example. Often, and I'm sure you've just seen this, people jump out of planes now, and they don't even have a parachute. And I saw this, and it's kind of unnerving just to watch it. You know what I mean?
Oh,
But
yeah.
what are they doing? They're making a calculation that they're jumping out of a plane without a parachute, and that the people who are jumping out with them are going to capture them before they hit the ground. And they're going to come down. So think about what that person's personality structure has to be to say, I'm going to engage in this risk assessment, and I believe that these people are going to capture me before I hit the ground. Now, I would have to say that that is a small, almost infinitesimal percentage of people. I mean, I can't even bungee jump.
Yeah.
Even if you had 10, you know what I mean?
I'm with you, Frank. I'm not bungee jumping either. So
even you
my,
can have
my super optimism doesn't exist. Yes.
Yeah, this is what I mean. So to answer your question is that how do we assess risk? They can be poor planners. So it doesn't mean that they get caught, that they didn't engage in risk assessment or it was impulsive. No, they're just poor at it. And some people might be better at it.
So you coined the term red collar crime. You talked a little bit about the case where, it kind of really got you thinking about this. What is red collar crime?
Red collar crime are basically fraud offenders who end up resorting to violence as a solution to silence those that may detect and or disclose their fraud schemes. And the reason why I chose red collar crime simply because of the imagery of what it is. Red is just simply more analogous to a violent offense. So white collar turns red, and they are basically a subgroup of white collar criminals. The reason why I wanted to focus on red collar crime is, and not just call them violent white collar criminals, is this. Because sometimes what happens is that if you don't understand the motive behind the crime, that can impact the investigation process. It can say, often you hear this, well, what's the motive? What's the motive? And that, if that's missing, that could be very problematic in a criminal prosecution. Although you don't need motive, a lot of people think you need a motive. It can be very helpful. So to say, well, these are just violent white collar criminals, you can have a white collar criminal who has what is referred to as like a mixed record. They could have fraud plus not, fraud plus violent offenses. But that doesn't tell you about the motive. And that's why I wanted to focus on the motive. And that's why red collar crime addresses the issue of motive specifically. So if I said to you, you know what, let's look at fraud detection homicide. All right. For example, you have sexual homicide. Well, we know the motive behind that homicide is sexual in nature. Well, fraud detection homicide tells you, okay, this homicide may be linked to a fraud that predated the murder.
I see.
Okay. And that can actually assist an investigation, say, for example, in an interview process, in terms of when you're interviewing people to try to back into it.
So to be clear then, is that you cannot have a red collar crime without a white collar crime. Is that the red collar crime is a subset of white collar crime, correct?
Right. The white collar offenders are the violent white collar offenders, red collar offenders are a subgroup of white collar offenders who are violent. They
So
resort
maybe
to
just
violence as a solution.
and so maybe then just expand on the motive, because one relates to the other. Is that the white collar crime relates to the red collar crime? Like they're linked. There's a linkage together. So maybe just talk a little bit about that, the motive element.
Sure.
Um,
So, for example, what you often see in my research on these cases is that the fraud offender starts to learn that a family member, a coworker, an acquaintance has somehow learned about their fraud scheme, or they may be on the verge of it. All right. So that fraud offender is thinking, I don't want to get caught. I have to silence this individual or in one or multiple people before I get caught. So they are committing fraud. Somebody may be onto them or close to it, and they silence that person so that their fraud is not disclosed, say, to law enforcement.
And the other question is how prevalent is this? Are we talking this is, once in a blue moon type of situation? Like you mentioned, you came across a case where this kind of got you thinking, or is this actually a lot more prevalent than maybe we would give it credit to? How prevalent are these are these red collar offenses?
I would have to say that we don't have enough research. We need more people to do that research. I have uncovered dozens of these cases, and I've tried to catalog them. So sometimes you'll have the homicide that actually occurred, and sometimes they're attempt cases where somebody actually tried to kill somebody but failed. Those are attempt cases. What I would share with you is that I think now I've brought to the attention of academics this concept, and many of some of the best people in the world have now started to look into this, who actually study criminology and criminal psychology, are now incorporating what I've done into their own scholarship. So I am pleased that at least it has started to resonate. And as it is in academics, it's like building a house, as one colleague told me, like one brick at a time. You start, then somebody else adds their piece, and so that you can start collectively trying to understand an issue. So the prevalence, I can't say. All I do know is that I've uncovered enough cases statistically that I know that it's not an anomaly.
Absolutely.
It's not this one-off. Absolutely not.
So I'm committing a crime, let's say a white collar crime. you're my boss, and let's say I'm stealing money from the company. I go off on vacation. You start reviewing bank statements that you would normally not otherwise look at. You figure out that I'm ripping you off. I'm ripping off the company. I get back from vacation and I have an email from you that says, Scott, I want to sit down and talk to you about this. I want to sit down and talk to you. So I go in your office, you lay it all out for me and basically say, Scott, like, we have a major problem here. So as it stands right now, I'm a white collar offender at that point. What is the characteristic that is going to push me over the edge to say, you know what, Frank, you're in my way. You're in my goal interference. When you're walking home, today we're going to, I'm going to crank this up a notch. We're going to, I need to silence this issue. Because that would seem to be quite different than the crime I'm currently committing, being white collar offense in terms of taking money from the business. That's one thing. To crank it up to a red collar offense is something completely different. And I'm just wondering, is there a set of characteristics that somebody would have that is going to escalate them from a white collar offense to all of a sudden a red collar offense?
Absolutely. And that's kind of at the crux of the whole matter. Meaning there's so much fraud and so much fraud gets detected.
Exactly.
How do we explain, we go from just say for stealing a few $1,000s to homicide. Okay. This is a big leap.
Yeah.
This is a massive leap. You see,
Absolutely.
this is what is fascinating about this area. And this is what I would share with you. Number one, red collar crime on balance is planned. It is not reactive. It's not one in which I'm confronted necessarily and on that moment of confrontation that I take somebody out. Because let's assume you're in somebody's office and they're confronting you with this. Are you going to go and commit murder in front of everybody? It's a question also of personality. Because at some point, if we have, say, two fraud offenders, they both go and engage in white collar crime. Why does somebody engage in murder and the other one doesn't?
Exactly.
Okay. And that's where it gets fascinating. The best I can back into over the 20 years I'm looking at this is, number one, we have to say, well, this person is displaying those antisocial criminal thinking traits. We have that. The question is, does that person also have different types of personality traits that might facilitate engaging in murder as a solution? And I would have to say there is. Do we need more research on it? You bet. But we have enough, what I would say is anecdotal evidence to support that there are certain personality types that may go down that path also. I can get into that if you want me to.
Well, look, the shocking thing about your book is that in the example I just shared, it is a subordinate, myself, talking to my boss, you, Frank. If we spin this around and say, you're now my brother or you're a direct family member, that doesn't necessarily change the issue. Is that if you were my brother, let's say, and you found out that I was stealing money from dad and you confronted me about it, the fact that you're my brother on some of these red collar criminals, it doesn't really matter. Is like you say, this is not a crime of emotion. This is a planned act, right? Like it doesn't really matter if they're related or not.
It's irrelevant. And they are going to approach this in a very cold manner. You are in their way. All right. They want something and you're in their way. And whether or not you're a spouse, a parent, a coworker, a boss, depending on that person, that fraud offender, making a decision of whether they're going to take you out or not. So it's irrelevant.
So then let's just talk about some of the characteristics that you have found that would differentiate between one white collar criminal who would just say, you know what, you got me. I'll do my time in jail and maybe I've got to repay back the proceeds. I'm going to lose my CPA, versus another person that's going to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to take you out. What are some of the, common characteristics. You talked about, appetite for risk as an example, jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. You talk in one of your videos about people swimming with sharks and not necessarily in a shark cage. Um, is appetite for risk one of those behavioral traits that might push a white collar person into a red collar crime?
It could be. It could also be that sense of immunity, that sense of super optimism, and that they think that they're, in a sense, it's kind of like they're so good at the fraud that they can superimpose those skills in planning a kill. So all of a sudden, you know what? For years, they got away with it. And you know what? This person is kind of a stone in my shoe. It kind of bothers me. I have to do something about this. It doesn't mean I have to do the killing. Maybe I'll hire somebody to take you out.
So in one of the chapters of your book, you also start to get into some of the specific character traits. The first one is psychopathy. Maybe just talk a little bit about the definition of that term and how that plays into a red collar criminal.
Sure. Psychopathy has to do with, and it's a massive topic, so I'm just going to try to give just a general explanation because we could spend the next month just on that concept. But basically, these are individuals who have either no emotional stance or blunted emotions. They understand the right and wrong, but they don't necessarily have the same physiological response to right and wrong. Maybe that sense of shame, that sense of remorse. They can have very much an antisocial quality about them that comes naturally to them also, but they can also be very hyper manipulative. And it's very much tied to aggression. They're cold, remorseless, without conscience is also thought about. But be careful in that, again, don't be seduced by the appearances that sometimes Hollywood likes to paint that picture of what a psychopath is. So we'll have that crazed person. And I'm just going to use somebody like Charles Manson. Most people, I'm sure they've heard of it. He has that crazy look about him. Oh, there's a psychopath. And then we paint the other one like Hannibal Lecter. Oh, there he is. There's that psychopath. And don't go down that path. And that they come in different flavors. And some of them have no criminal history in their background. Some of them do. There are many people in corporate America who run our corporations who are psychopathic. And we just don't know it.
Yeah.
We may know it because often we see people in our work environment that are like, boy, there's something off with these people, but they have no criminal history. So they may have the same attributes as a criminal, but they don't display them the same way. So they may be very remorseless and cold in their own environment. And they may say, well, I'm going to bully somebody. Bullying is very much tied to psychopathy versus somebody who's going to say, you know what, I'm psychopathic and I'm going to go and commit sexual assault. All right. So it's the coldness, the impulsivities at time, the remorselessness, pathological lying, the egocentricity. So think about it this way. You have this personality structure. Then you start to combine that with antisocial thinking.
Yeah.
I will share with you, you got a problem. You got a real serious problem because if all of a sudden you're thinking that murder is a solution and you're psychopath, making that leap is not going to be hard.
Yep.
Because you're already without conscience. And then if you're without a conscience and you think that person's getting in the way of what you want, that's not going to be tough. That's not going to be difficult to make that decision. It doesn't mean that you're good at it. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get caught, but to make that decision is facilitated. The personality facilitates the decision to go down a certain path.
So if we take that trait, this question's going to come up a couple of times as we go through these traits. Something like having no emotion or, not a typical reaction when you would, take somebody out. Is that something that you are born with, Frank? And again, I'm probably going to make this a bit too simplistic. Is that this psychopathy? Is this something that is a trait that you were born with, or does this get developed over time? Because something like that, like having no emotion to something like murder, like I don't. it just to develop that trait over a period of time, unless you had a childhood or an early adulthood, which was incredibly difficult. You know, you know, how does that trait build inside of somebody?
I think that's a fair question, and I would have to say that it's probably both. You might end up having somebody that, say, a child that may have had some traumas in their life,
Yeah.
and that their brain may never have developed in a proper way, and that they can end up growing up with psychopathic traits, even though maybe they never would have been. But somebody can also be born that way. From all the you can be born with that kind of disposition. So it's mixed, and it's complicated. It's mixed, but the risk factors are still going to be there. So
And
it's always an unsatisfying answer because everybody wants that one, answer to a problem. For example, everybody wants to know what makes a serial killer. Well, all the literature I've read, I cannot find one sense of what, the causation of it. It's mixed. But what I would share with you is that if you have those traits, it can be a problem.
yeah,
It can be a problem because think about it. If you have psychopathic traits and you don't have the emotions, that can also help you in the planning of the kill.
yeah,
You see, you're not being reactive. Typically, a reaction is one of an emotional outburst. If you don't have that, that means, you know what? This is a problem person. I don't have that emotional stance, but I know it's going to happen, and I'm going to try to plan it. So it can actually assist them in the planning of the kill. But the problem is that they may think they're so good that they're not going to get caught, and they end up leaving evidence behind.
then
I know I just gave you a lot.
well, yeah, like, the next question that people might be thinking about is, you mentioned we probably work alongside some of these people and we don't know it, which is pretty scary to think that, these folks may work amongst us and are just able to maybe suppress those feelings until they get into a situation, obviously, where they, like you said, they get caught in a white collar offense and then, it escalates. Is there ways to measure, where somebody is on the psychopathy, scale? Because one of the other things that really struck me in your videos was, I think it was relating to narcissism, which we're going to talk about. But you gave this executive a quiz on, narcissistic traits, and they ranked like a 32 out of 40, and that's like higher than a serial killer type of thing, right? Like it is quite scary. So in the case of psychopathy, is it possible to measure that particular trait in terms of where you are on the spectrum?
Absolutely. And they do have psychological assessments where you can measure whether or not somebody is clinically psychopathic.
Yeah.
There are certain types. The one that is commonly used is called the Haar Psychopathic Checklist by Robert Haar. He's an internationally renowned psychopathy expert. And I'll just try to give you a brief summary. Basically, it's an assessment between 0 and 40. And 40 would be like the perfect psychopath, okay? Typically, the cutoff seems to be around 30, but it is on a continuum. So they did one study, Dr. Haar and Dr. Babiak did a study, and they went into a corporation. So some of the scores typically, all right, let me back up. Typically, what I've read is that societally, clinical psychopaths are about 1% of the population. That's what I've seen, okay? In this study, about 4% almost 4% of their sample size within a corporation was psychopathic.
Wow.
About 8 of them, Scott, had scores 25 and above. Some of them had higher psychopathy scores than serial killers.
Wow.
And they occupied management. Okay. And these were well-educated people, doctors, lawyers, PhDs, and about 70+% of them had a minimum of a bachelor's degree within the sample size. So, again, not to be dramatic, they are amongst us. They are in our families. They are coworkers. They're not all in jail or in prison. So think about it. If 1% is the population, and within this sample, almost 4%, what am I getting at? Often when we see certain behaviors within the workplace, it's not an anomaly. It's not a one-off.
100%.
There's a reason for it. Okay. We don't just have, and most of us who have work experiences, we always can point to one person within that organization that is causing a lot of problems and nothing ever gets done. Now, I'm not trying to pick on organizations because it is what it is, whether or not it's a religious organization, the military, political environments, non-for-profit, it doesn't matter. Okay,
Yep.
They're everywhere. It's just a reality of the situation. There's always a reason because that is who they are.
Yep.
Sometimes the white-collar offenders or the ones that are unethical, they know how to walk that fine line. They just are, because they have higher cognitive abilities, they know what they can get away with.
Yep.
And they've also used their lifetime to practice. And often the practice starts in childhood. So by the time they become adults, they're already refining their manipulations. All right. So that's why a lot of people say, how could they have done this to me? Well, you know what? They've had a lot of practice.
Yeah.
You are just somebody who you are the target. Something's going to happen to you. It's harsh. I mean, work environments can be very difficult for people, and it can be difficult, especially when you have upper management that's condoning white-collar crime.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a long explanation, but I just want to give it some context.
Yeah. Well, I think, understanding that trait is pretty important. The other trait too is narcissism that you talk a little bit about. Maybe just talk, how does the narcissistic traits fit into a red collar criminal?
Sure. The research shows that those type of narcissists that are referred to as malignant narcissists, because narcissists too come in different flavors. So, for example, you might have those narcissists that are into entertainment. A lot of politicians are narcissists. Okay.
Yep.
So you get the point. But there are also those that are called malignant narcissists. What is that? That's when you take the concept of narcissism and you combine it with the antisocial traits that I talked to you before. Like you take psychopathy and then you combine it with those antisocial traits, you got a problem. You take narcissism and you start to marry that to those antisocial traits, you got a problem. What the research tends to show is that at least with the malignant narcissist, those that are highly exploitative, combined with that sense of high entitlement, I deserve this, are escalatory in terms of going from 0 to 60 in terms of violence. Now, It doesn't mean they're not planning it, but they see it as a solution. And then you start to combine that with the goal interference. I'm entitled to this. And on top of it, you're going to get in the way of what I want. And on top of it, I'm a narcissist.
Yeah.
You got a problem. So that's where you have to understand the personality to understand the risks attached to red collar crime. So that you don't have the problem, Scott, is all white collar offenders are homogenous. They're all kind of the same. They're like Bernie Madoff or who was it? Jeff Skilling from Enron. They're just kind of that milieu in a sense. They're all no, they're not. They all come to the table with a different set of personalities. And some will go down a certain path and some won't. So understanding that is important. Highly exploitative, highly entitled. On top of it, narcissists and psychopaths, they are heavily geared towards retribution, retaliation, revenge.
I see.
And they will target people who may not even be a problem. You may not even be a problem, but they perceive you as a problem. So there are those examples that, if we'll probably go over them, where you may have had a situation where the person that they killed had nothing to do, was no threat to them, but they took them out anyways. Why? Because if you don't have any emotions and you have that coldness in you, right?
Yep.
Well, you know what? I'm sorry, but I have to take you out. Do you know why? Because you're a witness. Even though I want to take out this person, you're just too close to that person, and that means that you could testify against me, so I got to take both of you out. And had you not been there, you would have been fine. But you just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to take you out. Or I'm going to pay somebody to take you out.
And something like malignant narcissism, can you measure that? Is that something that is
Narcissism
that's
can be
measurable as
measured.
well?
Yep, the
Yeah.
narcissistic personality disorder, there are assessments for that. And you would need somebody who again, is trained in to do that. And there was one case, in fact, that the person was assessed as having full-blown narcissistic personality disorder coupled with antisocial personality disorder,
Yeah.
i.e. the
Wow.
malignant narcissist. So yes.
You've mentioned this a couple times, but I was, hopefully you can touch on this a little bit more, is that this is not a crime of emotion. So maybe just cross compare, what a crime of emotion would be. I'm sure you've seen this enough times in your experience as an attorney, a crime of emotion versus a red collar offense that is perhaps not something that was in the heat of the moment or a crime of emotion. What's the difference between those
Sure.
if we compare and
Well,
contrast
for
that?
example, often reactive violence, crimes of emotions, what I mean by that is that something's triggering an emotional response that ends up in violence. So, for example, you may have domestic homicides. You have a couple that's engaging in some type of heated battle of something, they're arguing about something, and somebody pulls out a gun and shoots the other person. That's what I mean when I say that that there's a reactive quality to it, that the provocation leads to the violence.
I see.
But
in the case of a red collar offender, that's not the case, right? Is that this is not a crime of emotion.
These are, I mean, the person could be upset about the fact that they've been discovered, but that doesn't mean that particular moment they are actually engaging in a homicide. Absolutely not. They may actually sit back and think about, what do I have to do to take this person out?
Yeah.
They got to plan it.
And like Frank, you've sat across the table from these people. Like, again, as you mentioned, before we got live, again, you've been in courtrooms, you've been interviewing these folks. When you sit across the table from them after the fact, how does the conversation go? Like, is it are these? I don't even know how to articulate the question, but when you sit down, especially maybe earlier on in your career when you didn't have as much experience, when you're sitting across the table from a malignant a narcissist who displays or has psychopathic traits, like, how does that conversation go when you're asking them, like, how did this happen, or why did you do it, or whatever it may be? Like, maybe just take us inside to those interviews. How does this conversation actually go?
I would have to say early on, I didn't know what was going on. I got to be blunt. You see, I didn't know what was going on because you are dealing in a very different universe. Okay. When you are dealing and immersing yourself in criminality, that criminal thinking, the way a colleague of mine once described it is, Frank, when you see white, they're going to see black. When you see black, they're going to see white. And I'm going to explain that to you. So, for example, I tend to see goodwill, trustworthiness, trying to look after other people. If I see somebody that's hurt, to help them, as good qualities. You know what I'm saying? Characters that I look as a strength.
Yeah.
That's not how they see it. Because I harbor those, that actually makes me weak. All right. I'm an exploitable target.
Yeah.
Okay. So initially, when I started out in my career, I was in my 20s. Okay. So all of a sudden I'm going into an environment that is one of real hardcore criminality, and that can throw you off.
Absolutely.
Right? That can throw you off, and it can be challenging for a lot of people. And it's a question of your own resilience, because you have to understand that you're going to be dealing with a population that is there potentially to take you out. Now, what do I mean by that? Not because they're going to do something necessarily to me personally, but because for them it's this chess game. It's a game of the mind. How do I get into this person? How do I get under their skin? Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, no.
So
It
over a
would it
period of
would it
over a
also be
period
fair too, Frank, that these are high IQ people as well? Is that these
no,
are
no, no,
not
not
stupid people?
necessarily.
Yeah,
No, not
okay.
at all. Now that's and I'm glad that you brought that up. Often people think that they confuse manipulation with intelligence. Don't confuse the two. They're not the same thing.
Yeah.
You can be low IQ and be very manipulative. They may think they're very smart because they're just taking advantage of somebody who has even a lower IQ than them. All right. So what we've learned over the decades, though, is this. At some point, patterns develop. And that just as people of goodwill have certain common attributes that they display, a certain population also has certain traits that they display routinely. So at some point, as I always say, it's not the punch you see coming that hurts. It's the punch that you don't see coming that hurts. At some point, you see the punches coming, and you kind of adjust. It's like that chess game. You have to be ready for 10 moves in advance of where somebody's going in the conversation, and what you have to do to work within that system. So over a period of years, you understand the concept of antisocial criminal thinking, where they're going to be going, their interpersonal traits, and again, crime classification neutral. And point number 2, you don't have to commit a crime to display those traits, because those traits can be displayed in a work environment and nobody's committing any crimes. Okay.
And when the dust clears, do these folks have any remorse over what they've done? Do they feel bad for what they've done?
I would have to say that if you've been in an environment all your life of criminality, the remorse is that they got caught.
Yeah. Wow.
But I want to make it clear, perhaps had they been raised in a different environment and had been properly socialized, all right, they may have had a different outlook. But if you're an adult, now let's be clear, if you're an adult and you've been raised in an antisocial behavior your entire life, that's going to be a tough thinking pattern to reverse. Let me give you an example. If I said to you, I want you to stop what you're doing. Tomorrow, I want you to start selling crack cocaine. I want you to engage in smuggling. I want you to go bank robbery. Think of the type of shift that you would have to make to say, that's what I'm going to do from here on out.
Yep.
You couldn't even go there.
Yep.
You wouldn't even know how to process that. Well, now think of an adult who's been in criminality their entire life and saying, I want you to stop what you're doing. I want you to go back to school. I want you to earn a living the right way. Well, are you saying now that I have to give up, I make $10,000 a week selling cocaine to minors. I have to give up that to go to school? Are you telling me that's what I have to do now? All right. So it's really, really hard to shift that. All right. But you can also have somebody who is actually socialized properly in some of the cases that if we want to talk about them. But guess what? Their personality structure may have a certain bent to the antisocial way of life, regardless of how they are raised. And that gets back to the question that you asked earlier is, are they born with this?
Yeah.
Okay. So you could be raised by 2 great parents and you turn out to be something other. And as my friend would always say, this is how he characterized it. He said, Frank, sometimes dolphins give birth to a shark.
And
I think that is as beautiful of a way, the dolphin pod gave birth to a shark. And that it doesn't matter how much you're going to love the shark, Scott.
Jeez.
The shark is not going to love you back.
Do you think, do you think the dolphin knows it's a shark? Because, again, you talk a lot. There's a bunch of examples, few examples in your book where the son or daughter kills their parents. And in a lot of cases, they grew up in a good environment. From everything else, who knows? I guess we don't know. I guess all the facts, but from what you can gather, it would seem like grew up in a decent environment. Do you think in those examples, again, let's assume that's an example of a dolphin giving birth to a shark. Do you think the dolphin knows it's a shark and just tries to ignore it, or do you think they just don't even know it's a shark?
Well, I use the dolphin and shark because dolphins, my biology may be off. They're mammals, I believe, so it's kind of, this is, you remember, and I'm going to answer the question. Do you remember the movie Wall Street?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay. Do you remember what, Michael Douglas was called? Gordon Gecko.
Gordon Gecko. Yeah.
I believe a gecko was a lizard, a
Yeah.
reptile. And then you had Bud Fox, who was the mammal. Do you see? So you
Yeah.
have the mammal who is somehow trying to bond with a reptile. It's not going to
Yeah.
happen. Okay. Anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there for you. In terms of getting back to your question is, especially in families, you're going to be engaging in a lot of denial.
Yeah.
There's a lot of denial and it's total. I understand it. But the problem is that then when you get into the denial, then you are basically engaging in a flawed risk assessment of who you're dealing with.
Well,
And
it's hard. You can certainly sympathize if you're the mother or father. Again, we all know how we feel. You can certainly sympathize with denying. It would be a very, very difficult thing to accept that you got a shark in your water. That when your own traits are ones like you talked about earlier, caring and helping and things like that, and how that could happen, is probably beyond your comprehension. It just doesn't make sense. The other example, we exchanged a couple emails on nature versus nurture. And, you said, Scott, look, it's not that simple. There's no simple answer. And the analogy you drew was to Breaking Bad and Walter White. And, I'm sure a lot of people have seen Breaking Bad. Maybe just talk a little bit about that analogy where it's not a light switch that goes on and off. It's not something necessarily you were born with. You're either born with it or not. It's an evolution over time. Maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. The way to think about also thinking traits is that it can be a continuum. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be displaying all of them at the same time. Would you like me to talk about the Breaking Bad?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
I think it's a great example. High school teacher turned meth dealer and violent offender. Like that is a very interesting, transition, right? Or career path, let's call it.
I remember when I saw the series, I absolutely was fixated on it. And I thought, this is a master class on what can happen to a person over a period of time in terms of the criminality they display, which is facilitated by how they think. So for those of us who remember Breaking Bad with Walter White, he was a chemistry teacher. What did he start out? He said, I just wanted to make I think it was like $760,000. And
First cancer
I'm going to make
treatments.
some crack cocaine with Jesse.
Yep.
And well, okay. Well, then he gets that amount, but then he starts to escalate how much he wants to make more money, but he has to rely on more criminal thinking traits to push himself over the edge.
Yeah.
So what happens? He rationalizes what he's doing, and then he breaks the law. Then he starts to say, I'm entitled to this. And then you can see that sense of entitlement that he deserves it and that he is the best at this. Then what do you see? Then you see him say, I'm so good, I'm not going to get caught because I'm so good. Then what happens? Then people start getting in his way. And what do you see? The goal interference. So you go from a chemistry teacher who becomes a small-time crack dealer. I think it was crack, whatever it may have been. It was some type of
Meth.
type of meth.
Yeah. Yep.
So he goes from a chemistry teacher making some meth in some type of van to in big-time production. Then he ends up killing people.
Yeah.
A chemistry teacher to a killer. And it's a master class in how somebody can escalate their behavior. No differently than a white-collar offender who just does petty fraud and then becomes a killer. So anybody who is actually interested in looking at that, they can study that show. And each season, you start to see the progression of his criminal thinking traits come in full display, and he
Yep.
relies on them. So that's why I would share it's plausible. It happens all the time. And
Yeah.
red collar crime is a great example of that escalation.
Now, you talk a little bit in your book about a couple other topics, a couple other things we'd hit on here is murder for hire. I was told by, one of we had a former RCMP officer who used to work for the DEA as well, and he had told me at one point, he said, Scott, if you're looking at hiring a hitman for your job, said there's only two types of hitmen. There's hitmen that are crazy, and there's hitmen that are undercover cops. Those are the only two type of hitmen. Now you go into a little bit more detail in your book, but maybe just give us a little bit of perspective on this concept of murder for hire.
Sure. I enjoy what he said, and it's kind of has a catchiness to it, but unfortunately, I'm going to disagree. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Hitmen come in different complexions, and I'm going to say hitman just because on balance, from when I saw the research, they tend to be men. This doesn't mean women can't be, but it's just kind of the colloquial term that's used, a hitman. Typically, from what I see from the research, some of them are very skilled and they don't get caught. All right. They don't leave evidence behind. They know what they're doing. They engage in stalking behaviors. They go and surveil who they're going to take out. And they just know what they're doing. Typically, you also have in say, red collar crime, they hire people who are unprofessional. A lot of times, these are people who are low on their luck. Even the promise to pay is enough. Even if they don't pay them, the promise to pay is enough. They leave and I'm not trying to give any advice here. So I want to make sure, please, we got enough issues. We don't want a disclaimer. I'm not trying to give anybody ideas, but if you just to explain, what we see is that these are people who are down on their luck, and just the promise to paying them in drugs is enough to induce them to go and kill somebody. Now, what happens with many of them is that they leave a lot of evidence behind, cell phone, say, for example, DNA analysis, but they also brag about it. All right. They talk. And then what happens is they talk, and then those third parties go to law enforcement. Then the person who did the killing says, well, this is the person that hired me. And that's how they back into it. Often what you do, now I will agree with one thing that your colleague said, is that often what you have is these red collar criminals who are in jail on fraud cases. And then from jail, they try to hire somebody to kill people who have detected their fraud. And what happens is they'll send in an undercover cop who is posing as the hitman to make a deal. It's just unbelievable, the arrogance. And that's what I mean in terms of the personality structures. That's what you start to have to understand. So you have what are called organized and disorganized. You have the organized hitman who's going to get caught, and the disorganized. So those are the ones that leave evidence behind, and they're sloppy and they talk.
And would it be fair to say as well that at the first sign of trouble, they'll flip? They're not going to go to their grave with this secret. Is that if law enforcement gets on their trail and they start to figure out what happened, that the hitman will certainly reveal the full set of facts and circumstances.
In terms of the red collar, they flip.
Yeah,
that's what I've noticed. They flip. They know that, gee, what do I do? Do I spend the rest of my life in prison, or do I help out with law enforcement and cut a deal with the prosecution?
And is there a type of white collar offender who is going to jump into red collar crime that would hire a hitman versus someone who wouldn't? Is there a certain personality trait that fits, or is it just kind of random?
Well, that's interesting. The ones that I've noticed tend to be perhaps those with more mean. They would have more means.
I see.
To hire somebody. But what's interesting also, though, is in whether you get into it or not, is the gender differences in what they do. But what you'll see often is that they may actually have a family member go do the killing. So they don't necessarily hire them, but they'll farm it out to a family member.
So you mentioned gender. when we talk about, white collar offenders, we just actually had Kelly Paxton on, who both of us, that was actually how I had first reached out to you. Kelly had told me you must reach out to Frank Perri, one of the best guests she's ever had. She had very, very nice things to say about yourself, Frank. Her book is called Pink Collar, where she talks a lot about pink collar crime. Um, but from which gets affiliated with women, but I don't think that's as much to say about the gender per se, but rather the typical role in which these pink collar crimes occur. They're it's bookkeepers and clerks and things for whatever reason. For a lot of the way the statistic would roll up, a lot of those roles were filled by women as opposed to men, and therefore it wasn't so much that it was women that were doing it. It was more, and it was certain traits. It was more just the fact that there just happened to be a higher percentage of women that did those jobs, as opposed to men. Now, in the case of red collar crime, is there a gender difference? Because clearly in your book, again, you've got a lot of examples of both males and females. But I'm just wondering, does the red collar crime typically favor one versus the other?
Sure. From the research I can see, the majority are men, but the women that are involved are equally as, for lack of a better word, diabolical as the men in terms of what they do. Absolutely. The difference I would have to say is in terms of methodologies, they are pretty much co-equal with the men in terms of how they target and engage in the kill, in that they may use a gun, they may blunt force traumas, murder for hire. But the women red collar offenders tend to do two things that I found to be different. One of them is that they may engage in team efforts.
Oh,
And
really?
that they may, and the team efforts, and the other one is sedatives. So not necessarily poison, because that's kind of that's hard to define, but let's say sedatives, something to weaken the person. And I would have to say that those are the two things that distinguish the male from the female. But also with the females, what you'll see is that they will enlist their sons. They'll recruit their sons to carry out the kill. But at times they will also be part of the kill, but as a team effort.
Now, one of the good examples you have in your book is the Nancy Siegel case. Maybe just walk us through the Nancy Siegel case in terms of how white collar can turn to red collar.
Sure.
In Nancy's case.
Sure. This was a real sad case in which you had an elderly man, probably almost 30 years her senior. He was somebody who his cognitive abilities were probably compromised because of his age. And he meets this woman, Nancy Siegel, and basically it was his interpretation that they were in effect in a romantic relationship. She ends up basically having him move with her to remove him from the family, from friends. No differently than getting back to the analogy of what you see in the wild. They go and they try to separate the weak from the herd.
Yeah,
That's what she was doing. She was taking him and removing him so that they can't see what she's doing and protect him. She engaged in fraud, took all of his money and identity theft, bank theft. And then eventually, because she really couldn't get rid of him the way she wanted to, maybe dropping him off at a hospital, she didn't want to take him back to the family because they were going to discover the fraud that she perpetrated on him. So she ended up killing the man. And from what I can gather, it was from weakening through sedatives and I think perhaps strangulation. And they found the poor guy, I believe, near a some type of trash bin in Virginia. I believe he was naked in a trunk.
wow.
In a trunk. And he was, from all accounts, a kind man. And they were able to back into him who he was, I believe, through fingerprints and or his teeth from the military, because I believe he was a World War II veteran. So that's how they were able to find out who he was. Well, they found out that they were still dispersing Social Security checks and other forms of payment to her. And that's how they were able to back into her, because they would go to the P.O. box where she was receiving all the money. And over time, they made sure that she was the one that was collecting the checks. And eventually they went on to her and they said, "We need to talk to you." And that's how they were able to back into the murder. And one of the motives was that she was trying to prevent the disclosure of the detection and the disclosure of the fraud scheme, and that was able to come in at trial. So that's one of the. Sure.
I'm fascinated still about you mentioned, okay, law enforcement is on her. They bring her in. In your experience, when you sit down with them, like, are they, like as cool as a cucumber? Like, oh, hey, is just out for lunch, brought me in, and or again, are they like freaking out at this point? Like, that interview process or again, do they just have like absolutely no emotion to the crime? Like when you bring them in, are they pretty calm and collective, or can you tell to say, hey, look, like we've got we've got a live one here?
I would have to say it's mixed. To say, it's hard to say how they're going to react, but for some of them, they are very, very cool, cold, and in many respects, especially when you know that they did it, that's also a very good indication of what kind of personality trait you're dealing with.
Yeah.
And there are some examples that I'll be more than happy to talk about and how that did happen, where in that one case, Christopher Porco, I believe it was within 24 or 48 hours of the murder, he's interviewed, displays no emotions.
Wow.
Nothing. Imagine, and your audience listening, you get a phone call from law enforcement that one of your fathers was murdered and your mother is in the hospital, who's also possibly going to die. Most of us would probably have to be carried on a stretcher.
Yeah.
And he goes to that interview asking them questions. It's almost as if in that case, Christopher Porco, he's asking them questions like he's interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing him.
Yeah.
So this is where you see, now you're getting into those dynamics where if you don't know what you're doing and who you're dealing with, that investigation can go wrong. And the prosecution is only as good as the investigation.
So you talked earlier about, 4% of in one study, 4% of the corporation that was evaluated, the people had psychopathic traits. Any advice to people out there after hearing this? People might be thinking, man, I need to, rethink some of my coworkers in terms of who I'm working with. Now, again, we're hoping that this is the very small minority of the population who would fit into this, but it does happen. There is workplace violence that does that does occur, and I'm sure you've seen it. Is there any advice out there, Frank, to give to people to say, look, these are the things you need to at least be aware of, or things that you need to watch out for so that you're not a victim?
Sure. This is what I would say, and I'll just start out with family. If you have these situations in a family where you have a child, especially an adult child that may be living with you, that just never grew up, and they are basically committing fraud on the family, and as family that he had this history all his life, you're going to have to make some decision about how you're going to deal with this, because the reality is these can escalate in a deadly manner. So, are you safeguarding your checkbook? Passcodes, passwords.
Yep.
You get the understanding of that. Are you willing to change the locks on your house? I know these may sound very not be emotionally satisfying, but if you're asking me between life and death because of this, then you have to think about it. In terms of coworkers, that's a really, really hard one. You may not necessarily see that coming because they don't display that in outward emotional displeasures, even though they're planning your demise. That's very difficult to see. In terms of, say, fraud examiners, forensic accountants, people who are in compliance, all right, there can be something done to reduce and mitigate. For example, what time of day are you going to a job?
Yep.
All right. Does your management take threats seriously? Do you have a policy on how to deal with this? For example, what time of night? Are you going during the day or the night? Are you going as a team, 2 people? So there are a lot of ways that you can reduce the risk of harm, especially in these type of scenarios, because especially auditors and fraud examiners, I've had the situations in which they disclose, and it's also in the research where they have felt threatened, where they are apprehensive of their jobs because of their roles, and fraud examiners have been murdered. They have been murdered because of their jobs.
And what would be an example of that, Frank? Like they catch somebody, and like you said, it's at a planned event where they take out that fraud examiner.
Well, I'll give you a brief one. There was a forensic accountant, I believe it was in Cleveland, Ohio. He was investigating, I believe, would have been probably a Ponzi scheme that was perpetrated on the Amish community. And he's driving down the highway and all 4 of his tires blew out.
Wow.
And he's dragging. Thank God the car didn't blow up, but they just blew out. Okay. That's not coincidence.
Yeah.
All right. You have also cases in which fraud examiners may go to a place where they have to audit. And all of a sudden, given what they're dealing with, there was one case in which a female insurance investigator was killed because she was onto the insurance person who was stealing money, and he murdered her. This is where then you can hear from the management saying, well, we don't expect our people to be placed in this kind of harm.
Yeah.
Fair point. But this gets back to what we said originally. If you have a certain mythology about white collar crime, that means how you approach a risk assessment may be flawed. So when she says, I don't expect our people in the field to be put in this kind of danger, I understand where that person is coming from. But unless you correct the narrative and say the profile of the white collar crime is not homogenous, it's no different than any other crime classification, and they can resort to violence, you may not have the best practices in place to help mitigate the problem.
And let's say you were an internal auditor and you came to my office and and you say, look, Scott, we got to do an audit. We're going to, go through the numbers, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any characteristics that I would show at that time that would at least get you concerned that I would have some of those traits? You know what I mean? Like I think about, again, like you say, the insurance person goes out and visits somebody. The internal auditors are going out all over the place and meeting people all the time. Is there any warning signs that they should be aware of that say, look, if this person has, displays these kind of, like, maybe they get worked up, maybe they yell, maybe they scream, you know what I mean? Is there anything like that you'd say, you know what, they contain this, like, watch out?
Sure. Okay, I will answer the question, but something that you need to understand is that they may not display anything, number one. But let's assume they do. Are they argumentative? Are they belittling with you? Are they challenging your findings in an aggressive manner? Are they saying things to you that seem off color? Kind of like, what comes around goes around.
Yeah.
Things like, what I'm saying, things of that nature. Are they aggressive with you? Are they challenging your competence? Those are things that I personally would not ignore after studying what I've studied. But you also have to understand is that person might be thinking, you know what, I'm not going to do it myself. I'm going to hire somebody to do it. So how do you back into that? But
Yeah.
you may not. But what am I getting at? To answer your question, are there things you bet? Are there certain aggressive tones, argumentativeness, slamming the desk,
Yep.
challenging you, your professionalism? That's why you have to have a backup plan. That's why you have to have a plan with your auditors, forensic accountants, etc. If these type of things do come up, don't ignore them. Give us a call. Let us know where you're going.
Yeah.
So that we can take care of it. So there are mitigations.
Yeah, that's scary. That's certainly scary. And you talked a bunch about family, and how this can occur within family. Any advice for people as well in terms of saying, look, there's certain family members that I need to be careful of. Like, what would they share those same characteristics, Frank, that you just mentioned in terms of argumentative and all of that, or the people who commit these crimes against family, are different? Are they different and would show different characteristics?
Sure. I would have to say what I've seen is that they can be both. One can be such that family member may be exploitative within the family, but they are not interpersonally aggressive. All right. So you may have, say, somebody who is psychopathic and doesn't have emotions, and they're not going to necessarily display that outward aggressiveness, the tone. All right. Those are really, really hard to anticipate. And the family may not like the fact that they're getting ripped off financially, but they cannot imagine that that person would go that one more step and take them out.
Yeah.
All right. Those are the trickier ones. And that's where you get the situation in which family members may actually try to help that person for whatever reason, and they end up actually become a target too.
Yeah.
Very sad. You can also have the one in which they actually do display interpersonal aggressive behaviors. And they often, it's not just as adults, you saw it coming while they were children and then pre-adolescent and adolescent. So it's not like it's a surprise. Those situations, and then all of a sudden we end up having fraud because they're smarter and they end up taking thousands of dollars from the family members. If they've gotten away with those behaviors for so many years and now the family is pushing back,
Yeah.
you got a problem because now you're getting in the way of what they want. That sense of entitlement.
And if you use
so
an
the
example
signs
here,
are there, the signs are there. Then the question is, what are you going to do?
and if we're to use an example, maybe just, briefly touch on the Eric Hansen case, because I think that's a good example of well, basically, illustrating everything you just said in terms of where it can get really bad. So maybe just touch on the Eric Hansen case. Why is that such a good example of this?
That would be one in which all the signs were there, but they were unfortunately ignored. This was a case in which you had, his name was Eric Hansen. I believe he was about 27 or 28 years old. From all accounts, he came from a very good family. I would characterize it as upper middle class. He lived at home, but he was somebody that just from his childhood years, even before adolescence, he would engage in things like animal torture, going after the sister violently, domestics, home invasions. And then he was an adult, couldn't keep a job. The family did everything when he got in trouble, get him help. And then he gets to a point where now he's taking their identity. He's taken, 6 figures and just, again, buying himself things with that. And the sister confronts him and say, hey, what are you doing here? All of a sudden, that's where it triggers. Stay out of my life. I'm warning you. But this is the kicker. The mother tries to help the son by paying off all the credit card debt.
Yeah.
He lived at home. One night, he first kills the sister and the brother-in-law by blunt force trauma. In fact, the sister's name was Caitlin, and the husband was Jimmy. Jimmy's face was not recognizable because of all the blows. And Kate, basically her arms, I guess, were broken, defensive wounds. He then, at the house where he's living, goes into the bedroom and shoots the mother and the father in the head, drags their bodies and puts them where the sister and the brother-in-law are. I can go on, but that is kind of the summation. At trial, the prosecution said the motive was to prevent the detection and or disclosure of the fraud schemes that he had on the family. He was assessed with having narcissistic personality disorder coupled with antisocial personality disorder. That is basically throwing gas on a fire.
Yeah.
That was one in which the signs were there. They were screaming, and yet nothing was done. Nothing was done. Because what happens in these families is this. Typically in families, you remember when you were raised. If you do something good, you're rewarded. When you do something bad, you're punished. Okay? How do they look at it now? Not the way you look. How do they look at it? When you try to be the good guy, let's say the mom here, the good person, guess what? It's a weakness to exploit.
Yeah.
Her character, remember when I was talking about what do you see as a strength? That was a weakness to exploit.
When the family tries to push back and say, you can't do this, now it's goal interference. You're getting in the way of what I want. So that's why sometimes in family, Sky, you have this constant tension, massive turmoil, because nothing is going to work with these people. And as my colleague once said, he said, Frank, listen, either you're going to have to deal with the risk or you cut them off. Because the way they relate to you is not going to be the way people typically relate. And if you have somebody who is psychopathic or somebody who has that malignant narcissism, it's like getting back to the dolphin pod that gave birth to a shark.
Yeah.
Loving the child more isn't going to turn that child around so that they see the error of their ways.
Is there a way to turn them around, Frank? Like, can you get help for that person?
Well, the question is, how do you grow a new personality?
Yeah. Yeah.
If you lose your arm, are you going to grow a new one?
Nope. So can you grow a new personality? Is that possible?
I would have to say that's a little rough.
Yeah.
I don't know. How do you, when you have somebody that's that egocentric, how do you get them to have any self-awareness?
Yeah.
If you're an adult, okay, by the time you're an adult, you're pretty set.
Yeah.
Right? You're pretty set. I'm not saying that's not possible, but if you're asking me on a continuum, the older you get, the harder it is. That much I think is pretty clear. And if you have somebody who's an adult planning to take out family members, that's a rough one to turn around.
Yeah.
Because if your personality is one in which you see black, they see white, you see white, they see black, how do you turn that around?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a chilling thing here to wrap up on, but
This has
we
been
could
an
talk for an
uplifting
awful long time.
conversation.
This has been a really, really fascinating conversation. I think, again, when I read your book and watched those YouTube videos, it opens your eyes the same way, you had mentioned your eyes were opened earlier in your career when you kind of came across the same thing. I think for everybody else, you don't need to go through that. You can just watch Frank's YouTube videos and read his book, and you're going to learn. It's really going to open your eyes up on red collar crime. And maybe, Frank, just a little bit about yourself. What keeps you busy these days? How do people get in touch with you? How do you occupy your time right now?
Sure, I would say anybody that wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn, please reach out. Also, you can share my email if you would like to. Anybody that wants to share their stories or whatever. I get a lot of emails just unsolicited from family. That's where I get a lot of emails from.
Really?
Where they've read my work because they've had these travesties in their family that they never understood how to understand what happened. And they've read my work and they've at least now have a template to understand their sibling or what happened, because there's so much pain in that family that will never be reconciled. But that at a minimum, if I've been able to offer some explanation to what happened, it was well worth it. So often I'll get that, I read your work and it explained why my brother killed my parents.
Wow.
Something of that nature. So, and not only that, it's also helped people in their work environments. Often I will get emails from people who have been in work environments and just don't understand what's happening to them. The bullying, all of that. And I've tried to address some of that in the book to try to maybe help them understand what is causing this problem. Because often, and I'm not saying anything that is not documented, many people are so bullied at work that they need therapy.
Yeah.
And it's sad. But
well, look, you think about how much time we spend at work. You spend a lot of your waking hours at work, and what's your advice to them, Frank? Do you just tell them, like, at some point you just got to move on and get a new job?
I would have to say that this is hard. It's always easy to give advice, but to implement it's different. But if you can move on, try to move on, because those environments are destructive.
Yeah.
They will kill your spirit. They will kill your spirit, your motivations. People get sick. People end up getting PTSD
Yeah.
because of these environments, because they're in them so long, like you aptly stated. And it's horrible. And the personality traits of psychopathy and narcissism are tightly correlated to bullying in work environments and committing fraud. So think about it. You're being bullied, then you're in an environment that's committing a crime. You got a problem.
Yeah.
So it's a big topic. It can be addressed at a later point if there's any interest in this. But this is one area that I've always really appreciated talking to other people and trying to help them. Because
I think it happens a lot more frequently than you give it credit
because
for.
I bet
You know,
if
you would
did
know.
a survey, if you actually talk to people about what happens in their work environment, it's painful.
Yeah.
It's really painful. And it wasn't, I've been in those environments. And had I not engaged in the type of research that I did to understand it, I don't know how I would have dealt with this.
Yeah.
But it helped me at least understand what was happening and who it was coming from. And at least it gives you some framework to understand your environment.
Yeah.
So
Can we expect another book, Frank, or an update on the book? I'm sure these red collar crimes are happening as we speak. I think the book is 2 years old? Is that how how old the book is?
it is. It's a few years old. What I typically do is I update it with new cases. So I decided to self-publish the books that I had that freedom to update it at my leisure.
Yep.
So whenever it gets updated, I'll just put another edition out. And, that's basically what I've been doing to now. And I'm also branching out on some non-white collar crime type of topics also, given that I've dealt with them for so many decades.
Yeah.
And of course, I lecture throughout the country on white and red collar crime.
Yeah. Well, Frank, thank you very much for taking the time today. We really appreciate it. I think people are going to walk away from this with a lot of information. A lot of information that they certainly didn't know beforehand. You bring can you go back to your background, lawyer plus accountant, and especially again, like red collar type of lawyer combined with red collar type of accountant. Very few people are like that, but thank you very much for taking the time. It's been a very, very interesting conversation.
Wonderful. And I look forward to this coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps another episode of CSI Chat, and I really wanted to thank everybody for listening. If you want to keep up to date on CSI Chat, I would encourage everyone to join our CSI Chat LinkedIn group and or follow us on Twitter/X under CSI Chat. With that, I will get you out of here on a high note with some music, and thanks again.
Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our host and accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers meet the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. CSI Chat, where the numbers meet the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. Tune in every week for a mix of win facts with a clever accountant who's got your back. We'll laugh and we'll learn and solve the mystery on CSI Chat. accountant who's got your back. We'll laugh and we'll learn and solve the mystery on CSI Chat, where the topic set us free. CSI Chat is the podcast you'll adore. With our accountant host, you'll always want more. So grab your headphones and join the fun on CSI Chat, where the mystery's never done. We'll see the case through. We'll see the case through.